The moving truck was halfway up my muddy lane when its rear tires started spinning, and a man named Ronnie Kessler leaned out of his pickup window shouting that I could not keep his family out of their own home. Rain was coming down sideways, his daughter was crying in the passenger seat, and my old VHS camcorder was balanced on the porch rail, recording every ugly word. The only problem was, the little stone cottage he wanted to move them into had belonged to me for exactly 11 weeks, and to Ronnie Kessler, not one day of his life. My name is Joanne Maddox, but everybody around Hollow Creek called me Joe, mostly because that is what people do in small towns when they do not know whether to treat a woman like a neighbor or a threat. This happened in the fall of 1995, back when folks still left messages on answering machines, when county records came in manila folders instead of computer screens, and when a person could still drive 20 miles into the hills and feel like the whole world had forgotten they existed. I had just turned 51 that year, and after spending most of my adult life trying to keep everybody else comfortable, I bought myself 43 acres of old orchard land outside a little town in eastern Kentucky called Marrowfield. It had an apple barn with a roof that sagged in the middle, a spring house that smelled like wet stone and pennies, a crooked white farmhouse that had not seen a proper coat of paint since Nixon was in office, and down near the creek, half hidden behind black walnut trees, a one-room caretaker cottage with a rusted tin roof and a porch, no bigger than a church pew. It was not much to look at, but the first time I stood there with the leaves blowing around my boots, I felt something in my chest loosen. I had spent 26 years married to a man who treated every room in every house we ever lived in like it belonged to him first and me second, and by the time I left that marriage, I had become the kind of woman who apologized when somebody bumped into me. So when I found that old orchard, all I wanted was quiet. I wanted a place where nobody needed my permission to borrow money, where nobody expected dinner at 6, where nobody said, "Well, Joe, that is just how things are." The seller was a widower named Mr. Pritchard, a thin old man with hands like tree roots and a voice that sounded like gravel in a coffee can. He met me at the gate wearing suspenders and a John Deere cap that had probably outlived 3 tractors. He walked me around the property slowly, not because he was trying to sell me anything, but because I think he needed to say goodbye to the place one more time. He pointed out the apple trees his father planted in 1948, the creek bank that flooded every spring, the old smokehouse where his mother used to hang hams, and the lane that ran from the county road across a wooden bridge and up through the orchard. When we got to the bridge, he stopped and looked at me hard. He said, "This right here is the part folks are going to fuss about." I asked him what he meant, and he pulled a folded map from his jacket pocket, the kind of map with yellowed edges and blue survey lines drawn by hand. He tapped the lane with his finger and said, "This road belongs to the orchard. It always has. Old families around here used it because my daddy let them, then I let them. But that is not the same thing as owning it." I remember laughing a little because I honestly thought he was just warning me about neighbors cutting through to fish in the creek. I said, "I can live with folks driving by once in a while." Mr. Pritchard looked at me again. Then he said, "You may not be dealing with folks, Joe. You may be dealing with Ronnie Kessler." I had never heard the name before, but the way he said it made me pay attention. He did not sound scared of Ronnie exactly. He sounded tired of him. "There is a difference, Mr. Pritchard told me Ronnie grew up 2 hollows over, that his father had worked at the old cider mill when the orchard was still making money, and that Ronnie had spent most of his boyhood hunting squirrels in the woods behind the barn and swimming in the creek. He told me Ronnie had once been a volunteer fire chief, owned a body shop in town, and had the kind of personality that made people nod along just to get out of the conversation. Then he gave me a small stack of documents, including the deed, the survey, an old county letter confirming the lane was private, and a termination notice from 1958 that had ended a previous easement before I was even born. He said, "Keep these dry, keep them close, and do not let anybody tell you history is the same thing as ownership." 3 weeks later, I bought the orchard. I drove up that lane in my old Buick with a thermos of coffee on the seat beside me, and I remember thinking the silence was the prettiest thing I had ever heard. No television through the walls, no neighbors arguing on their porch, no husband asking why I'd spent $20 at the grocery store. Just tires on gravel, crows in the trees, and the creek moving down below like it had somewhere important to be. Then I came around the bend by the old barn, and there he was. Ronnie Kessler stood in the middle of the lane with one boot on a rock and one hand resting on the hood of his white Ford pickup. He was maybe 58, broad in the shoulders, grey hair under a ball cap, a red face that looked like it had spent 30 years leaning over engines and arguing at town meetings. He had a clipboard tucked under one arm, which should have told me right away that peace was not in the cards. He held up one hand like he was stopping traffic on Main Street. I rolled down my window and said, "Can I help you?" He leaned down, looked inside my car, and said, "You must be the lady from Ohio." I told him I had lived in Ohio for a while, but I was from Kentucky originally. He smiled without any warmth in it and said, "Well, that explains why nobody told you about the road." I asked him what he meant. He tapped the clipboard against my door and said, "This is a community access lane. Always has been. Folks come through here for the creek, for the old cottage, for emergencies. You cannot just close it off because you bought yourself a few trees and a broken house." I pulled the deed from my purse because I had been carrying it around like a new driver carries her first license, and I held it up in the window. I said, "Ronnie, right?" He nodded. I said, "This says the lane belongs to the orchard property." His mouth tightened a little. Then he said, "That might be what the paper says, but paper does not know this place." I wish I could tell you I had some sharp, clever answer ready, something that would have made him look foolish right there in the road, but I did not. I was still the old version of myself then, the woman who thought every tense moment might be solved if she smiled politely enough. So I just said, "I am not closing anything today. I am moving in." He stepped back, but before I drove away, he said, "You will learn soon enough, Joe. Around here, people remember what belongs to them." I spent the next few days cleaning the farmhouse, hauling trash bags full of moldy curtains, broken jars, and enough dead mice to make me question every decision I had ever made. The place was rough, but it was mine. Every nail I pulled out of a rotten board felt like I was removing something old from my own life. I hired a carpenter named Leon Bates to fix the barn roof and repair the cottage porch, and for the first week, everything went about as smoothly as a country renovation can go. Then Leon showed up one morning looking annoyed. He said, "That fella down the road stopped me at the bridge." I asked, "Ronnie?" Leon nodded. Said you did not have permits. Said the county was looking into you. Said I might want to keep my truck off this land. I told Leon I had the permits for the electrical work and the structural repair, and he just shrugged. I did not think he believed Ronnie, but I could tell he did not like being dragged into somebody else's feud. 2 days later, I found a notice taped to my windshield. It was printed on white copy paper with a hand-drawn emblem at the top that read, Hollow Creek Preservation Council. Underneath it said, unapproved alterations to historic community structures are prohibited. It also said I could be fined $200 per day. I stood there in the driveway holding that piece of paper, while the wind blew leaves around my ankles, and I laughed so hard I scared myself. Not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so plain, so childish, so completely made up. There was no preservation council. There was no historic community structure. There was an old cottage with a hole in the roof and a family of raccoons living in the wall. Still, I kept the notice. I put it in a folder. Then I found another one on my porch, and another tucked under the wiper of Leon's truck, and another mailed to my house with no return address. I started keeping them all. By the end of October, I had a binder on my kitchen table full of Ronnie's little paper kingdom, every fake warning, every note, every angry message on my answering machine. One of the messages said, "This is not over, Joe. You cannot erase people just because you have a deed." I played it back twice. Then I rewound the tape and saved it. My sister called me around that time and asked why I did not just ignore him. I told her I had tried. She said, "Well, maybe he is lonely." I said, "So is a rattlesnake, but I am not letting one sleep in my kitchen." That was the first time I noticed something had changed in me. I was still nervous, still tired, still wishing I had bought a condo near a grocery store instead of a haunted orchard in the hills. But I was no longer willing to make myself smaller, so a man like Ronnie could feel bigger. Part 2. The turn. The trouble really changed shape when Ronnie started talking about his daughter Lacey. I had seen her once or twice in town, a thin woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and a little boy named Cole who could not have been more than 6. I heard through the diner waitress that Lacey had separated from her husband in Louisville and moved back in with Ronnie while she figured things out. I felt for her, I really did. I knew what it was like to leave a bad situation and realize the world does not always clap for you when you finally do the brave thing. But Ronnie did not come to me asking for help. He came to me making arrangements. One morning I was painting the porch rail on the cottage when I heard his truck rumble up to the gate. He got out wearing a denim jacket and carrying a grocery bag full of apples from the supermarket, which was almost funny because he was standing on an apple orchard. He set the bag on the porch and said, "Lacey and Cole are going to need somewhere to stay for a little while." I put my paintbrush down and said, "I am sorry to hear that." He nodded like we were having a normal conversation, then pointed toward the cottage. "That place has always been used by people around here. My daddy stayed there during hunting season. I stayed there when I was a boy. My sister had her wedding shower in that barn. It is only right Lacey gets the cottage until she gets back on her feet." I looked at him for a long second. Then I said, "Ronnie, you just described memories. You did not describe a lease." He stared at me. I said, "I am sorry your daughter is having a hard time. I mean that. But she cannot move into my property because you remember eating cake here in 1971. His face changed then. Not loud at first. Not dramatic. Just that tight little shift around the mouth when somebody realizes you are not going to hand them what they came for. He said, "You got no idea what this place means to people." I said, "No, I probably do not, but I know what it means to me." He leaned closer and said, "You are making a mistake, Joe." I told him I have made plenty of those. Buying this orchard was not one of them. After that, things got uglier. Ronnie started telling people I was planning to turn the property into some kind of exclusive ladies' retreat for rich women from Cincinnati. I do not know where he got that idea. Maybe because I had fixed the cottage porch and put curtains in the windows. Maybe because he had never seen a woman buy land without asking permission from the men around her. This hardware store owner told me Ronnie had called pretending to be my contractor, trying to cancel an order of shingles. The feed store owner said Ronnie told him I was under investigation for dumping trash in the creek. The county inspector came out one afternoon after somebody reported that I was rebuilding the barn without approval, but the man took one look at my permits, checked the work and said, "Let me guess, Kessler." When I nodded, he sighed the way a man sighs when he has heard the same bad song too many times. He said, "You are not the first person he has tried to run out of here." That sentence stayed with me. I went to the county courthouse the next morning and asked for every record connected to the orchard. The clerk was a woman named Mrs. Buss. Tully, maybe 65, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the sort of face that made you feel like she already knew every secret you'd ever kept. She listened while I explained what Ronnie was saying about community access. Then she walked me into the records room, pulled out a drawer, and found the old plats. We spent nearly 2 hours going through yellowing maps and typed letters, and by the time I left, I had copies of every document I needed. There was no public access, no community claim, no shelter designation, no right-of-way. The cottage had once been used during the flood of 1974, but only because Mr. Pritchard's father had let 3 stranded families sleep there for one night after the bridge washed out. One night of kindness had turned into 20 years of somebody else's legend. I took the papers to a lawyer in town named Margaret Vance. Margaret was maybe 50, always wore low heels and dark lipstick, and had a way of looking at a man that made him explain himself twice. Her office was above the pharmacy, with a little bell over the door and a framed picture of her law school class hanging crooked on the wall. She read through my folder, listened to the answering machine tape, looked at the fake council notices, then leaned back in her chair and said, "Jove, this man has confused being loud with being right." I said, "Can I stop him?" She said, "You can stop him legally. Whether he stops himself is another matter." That was when we sent Ronnie a formal letter. It stated the lane was private, the cottage was private, the bridge was private, and any further attempts to interfere with my contractors enter the property or misrepresent himself as part of a county organization would be documented. I had hoped the letter would embarrass him enough to make him back down. Instead, it seemed to give him a fresh supply of fuel. 2 weeks later, I woke up to find a sign nailed beside my gate. It said, "Historic Hollow Creek Refuge Site. Community access protected since 1932. I stood there holding my coffee, still wearing my robe, staring at that sign like it might explain itself. Then I went back inside, got my camera, took pictures from every angle and called Margaret. She laughed once, without humor, and said, "Do not touch it yet. Call the sheriff first." Sheriff Boyd Harper came out that afternoon. He was a decent man, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, with a permanent coffee stain on one shirt pocket and the habit of taking his hat off whenever a woman cried, even when she was crying because she was angry. He took pictures of the sign, asked me whether I had seen Ronnie put it up, and I told him I had not. He said, "We both know who did it." I said, "Does that help me?" He looked at the cottage, then at the barn, then at the lane disappearing down toward the road. He said, "It helps you if you keep your temper. Men like Ronnie depend on other people losing theirs." I did not want to admit how close I had come. Some nights, I would sit in the farmhouse kitchen with the curtains open, watching headlights pause down by the bridge, and I would feel the old version of myself coming back. The woman who hated conflict, the woman who wondered whether being peaceful meant letting other people walk over her. Then I would look at the house around me, the walls I had patched, the floor I had sanded, the porch I had painted myself, and I would remember why I was there. I had not bought that land to prove anything to Ronnie Kessler. I bought it because I wanted one place in this world where I did not have to surrender just to keep the peace. So, I did what Margaret told me. I bought a used camcorder from a pawn shop in town. I installed a floodlight near the gate. I put a heavy chain across the bridge and a private property sign on both sides. I made copies of every document and kept one set at Margaret's office, one set in my kitchen drawer, and one set in the trunk of my Buick. It may sound dramatic now, but at the time, it did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary. The first time Ronnie tested that chain, I was in the barn sorting old jars when I heard an engine revving hard. I walked outside and saw his truck pressed up near the bridge, bumper inches from the chain. He got out, looked at the sign, then looked up at me. He said, "You think a chain makes you queen of the mountain?" I said, "No, Ronnie, the deed does that." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. He pointed at the cottage and said, "My daughter and grandson need a roof. You have 2 houses. You're one person." I said, "And you have a house down the road." He said, "That is not the point." I told him, "No. That is exactly the point. You do not need this place. You want it because you think you should get to decide what happens here." He stepped closer, his face turning red. Then he said, "You really want to make an enemy out of me." I remember feeling my hands shake. I remember thinking about backing up, softening it, saying something nice just to make him leave. Instead I said, "Ronnie, you were an enemy the minute you decided my no did not count." He stared at me for a few seconds, then got back in his truck and drove off hard enough to throw gravel against the barn wall. That was the day I knew there would be no quiet ending. Not the kind where he got bored and moved on. He had built his pride around the idea that he belonged on my land, and every piece of evidence I found only made him more desperate to prove otherwise. The final warning came on my answering machine 3 days before the storm. I had been in town buying kerosene when I came home and found the little red message light blinking. I pressed play and Ronnie's voice came through the kitchen, low and certain. He said, "Friday afternoon, I am bringing Lacey and Cole up to the cottage. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard." Then the tape clicked off. I stood there for a long time with my hand on the machine. Outside, the sky had gone grey over the ridge. The weather report said heavy rain, possible flash flooding, and wind strong enough to bring down limbs. I called Margaret. She told me to call the sheriff, keep the camcorder ready. Do not confront Ronnie alone if I could avoid it, and above all else, do not let the storm turn him into your problem. I did not understand what she meant until Friday came. Part 3. The line holds. By late afternoon, the rain had swallowed the valley. The creek had risen over its banks, brown and fast, carrying branches and pieces of somebody's fence downstream. I had spent the day boarding the farmhouse windows and checking the cottage roof. Then I went inside and made a pot of coffee, even though my hands were shaking too badly to hold the mug steady. Around 6:30, the power flickered once, then again, and the floodlight at the gate blinked on. I looked through the kitchen window and saw headlights coming up the county road. First Ronnie's white Ford, behind him a rental moving truck with a blue stripe down the side. Behind that a little red sedan with Lacey in the driver's seat and Cole pressed against the window in the back. I remember thinking, he actually did it. He actually brought a moving truck into a flood because he thought a storm would make me say yes. I grabbed the camcorder, slicked on my raincoat, and walked out onto the porch. By the time I got down to the bridge, Ronnie was already out of his truck, soaked through, yelling over the wind. The moving truck had stopped at the chain, its tires cutting deep ruts in the mud. Lacey was sitting in the sedan with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, like she wished she could disappear into the rain. Ronnie shouted, "Open the gate, Joe." I said, "Take them back down the hill." He threw his arms out and said, "Look at the weather." You were going to stand there and leave a woman and a child out in this. I said, I will call the church shelter in town. I will call the sheriff. I will even give Lacey the number for a motel if she needs it. But you are not moving into my cottage. He laughed once, loud and bitter. He said, you think you are some kind of saint because you offer a motel room. That cottage has been ours longer than you have even known this county existed. I held up a camcorder and said, Ronnie, you are making this real easy for me. He took a step toward the chain. Then Lacey got out of her car. She looked exhausted, drenched, and angry in a way that did not belong to me. She shouted, Dad, stop. He turned around and said, you stay out of this. She said, I asked you if this was your place. He told me it was. Ronnie looked at her, then at me, and for the first time all night he did not have an answer ready. The rain came down harder. The moving truck driver leaned out his window and yelled that he was not taking the truck any farther until somebody told him what was going on. Ronnie yelled back that it was private family business. The driver said, Sir, I do not care if it is the Gettysburg Address. I am not driving this thing into a creek. That might have been funny under different circumstances. It was not funny then, but I will say this. It was the first moment I saw Ronnie lose control of the story he had been telling everybody. He had always depended on being the loudest man in the room, but now there was no room, just mud, rain, a stranded moving truck, a frightened little boy, and a woman he had lied to standing in the middle of it all. Then the sheriff's lights appeared down at the road, blue and red flashing through the rain like somebody had turned on a jukebox in hell. Sheriff Harper pulled up behind the sedan and got out with his hat pulled low and his jacket already so dark. He walked up to the chain, looked at me, then looked at Ronnie. He said, Ronnie, what are you doing? Ronnie pointed at the cottage and said, this woman is blocking my family from shelter. Sheriff Harper said, that cottage belongs to Joe. Ronnie said, my family has used it for years. The sheriff said, using something with permission is not the same as owning it. Ronnie said, we have rights here. The sheriff looked at him for a moment and said, you have a right to turn this truck around while somebody gets hurt. Ronnie turned toward me again, and his face had gone pale under all that rain. He said, you were really going to do this? You were really going to leave my daughter and grandson out here? I felt something twist in my chest because that was the part that hurt, the part that was designed to hurt. Lacey and Cole were not the enemy. They were not the people who had sent fake notices, lied to contractors, nailed false signs at my gate, and tried to turn my kindness into a weakness. But if I opened that chain, even once, under pressure in a storm, because Ronnie had arranged the situation to make me feel guilty, then I knew it would never end. I looked at Lacey and said, I'm sorry you are caught in this. I mean that. But there is a shelter at the Baptist Church off Route 11. Sheriff Harper can escort you. You and Cole can be safe tonight. Ronnie shook his head and said, do not listen to her. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I said, this is not about safety, Ronnie. If it were, you would have taken them to the shelter an hour ago. This is about winning. That landed harder than I expected. He looked like I had slapped him. Lacey began crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just standing there in the rain with both hands over her face. Cole started crying in the car too. The moving truck driver put the truck in reverse, but the rear wheels spun and slid sideways in the mud. For one long second, the truck leaned toward the ditch, and every person there went quiet. Sheriff Harper yelled for everyone to move back. Ronnie ran toward the driver's side, but the driver waved him off and said, get away from the truck. Lacey grabbed her father's sleeve and shouted, Dad, please. It was the first time I heard fear in her voice. Real fear, not anger. Ronnie stood there with rain running off his face, staring at the cottage behind me. It was just a little stone building with one yellow porch light glowing through the storm, but to him it had become something bigger than a house. It had become proof that he still mattered, proof that he still had power, proof that the world had not moved on without him, and that was the saddest thing about it. He could have asked for help. He could have told the truth. He could have brought his daughter to me weeks earlier and said, Joe, I was wrong about the road, but my family is in trouble. Can you help me find a place? Maybe I would have. Maybe I would have made calls, offered money, helped Lacey get an apartment, watched Cole for an afternoon while she filled out paperwork. But Ronnie did not want help. He wanted obedience. Sheriff Harper stepped closer to him and said, you need to make a decision. Either take your family to the shelter, or I am going to cite you for trespassing and reckless endangerment. Ronnie looked at me one last time and said, this is not over. I took the chain in my hand, pulled it tight across the bridge, and locked it with the heavy padlock I'd bought after his first warning. The click of that lock was small, but in that storm it sounded louder than thunder. I said, "It is over tonight." The truck finally backed down the lane with the sheriff guiding it inch by inch, tires sliding in the mud. Lacey got into her car without looking at Ronnie. Cole pressed his little face against the back window, and for a second I almost walked over there. I almost opened the chain. But then Lacey looked at me through the rain and gave the smallest nod, like she understood something I could not say out loud. Ronnie stood beside his truck for another minute, soaped and shaking, then he got in and followed them down the hill. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend. When the last red glow faded into the rain, I stood alone at the bridge with the camcorder still running. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired all the way down to my bones. I walked back to the farmhouse, made another pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until dawn. The storm passed sometime before morning. I know because the silence woke me. 3 days later, Margaret called and said Ronnie had filed a petition with the county court. He was claiming historic access rights to the lane, community use of the cottage, and emergency occupancy for Lacey and Cole. I laughed when she told me, then I felt ashamed for laughing because it was not funny anymore. It was just sad and expensive. Margaret said, "Good. Let him put it in writing." So we prepared. I gathered the deed, the surveys, the old county letter, the notices, the answering machine tapes, the photographs of the fake sign, the inspector reports, the sheriff's report, and the VHS tape from the storm. By the time we were done, the binder was thick enough to stop a door from closing. The hearing was held in December in a small courtroom above the county clerk's office. It smelled like dust, old wood, and somebody's burnt coffee. Ronnie came in wearing a brown suit that did not fit him right. Lacey was there too, sitting behind him holding Cole's hand. She looked smaller than I remembered. Ronnie had a stack of old photographs, copies of newspaper clippings, a few pages of typed statements from people who remembered using the orchard years ago. When the judge asked him to explain his claim, he stood up and talked for 20 minutes about tradition, community, history, hardship, and the old flood. He talked about his father, his childhood, the creek, the apple barn, the cottage, and how people in Hollow Creek had always looked after one another. Some of it was true. That was what made it hard to listen to. The orchard had been part of people's memories. Families had used it. Kids had played there. People had gathered there once upon a time. But none of that gave Ronnie the right to decide it was still his. When he finished, the judge turned to Margaret. She stood up, adjusted her glasses, and began laying out the evidence one piece at a time. The deed, the survey, the private lane certification, the easement termination, the county records, the photographs of the false signs, the answering machine tape. Then she rolled a television cart into the courtroom, put the VHS tape in, and played the storm footage. There was Ronnie in the rain shouting that the cottage belonged to his family. There was Lacey asking him if he had lied to her. There was Sheriff Harper saying the property was mine. There was the moving truck sliding in the mud while Ronnie ignored every warning. Nobody said a word while the tape played. Even Cole was quiet. When it ended, the judge looked at Ronnie and asked, "Do you have any legal document proving ownership, tenancy, easement, or community access rights?" Ronnie shuffled through his papers. He held up a photograph of his father standing near the barn in 1969. The judge looked at it and said, "Mr. Kessler, a photograph is not a deed." Ronnie said, "But that place was always ours." The judge said, "No. It was always someone else's property that your family was sometimes allowed to use. There is a difference." Then she denied his petition. She granted a no trespass order. She ordered him to stop contacting my contractors, stop representing himself as part of any county organization, and stop interfering with my use of the lane and cottage. It was not dramatic, the way movies make courtrooms dramatic. There was no music. Nobody gasped. The judge just signed the paper, and the bailiff said the hearing was over. But when I walked out into the cold December air, I felt something leave my body that I had been carrying for months. Not anger, not fear, just the weight of always waiting for the next knock on the door. A week later, I got a letter from Lacey. It was handwritten on lined notebook paper. She said she was sorry. She said she had not known the cottage was not Ronnie's, and that she had believed him because she needed to believe somebody had a plan. She said she and Cole were staying in an apartment in town, and that the church had helped with the deposit. She did not ask me for anything. She just said she was sorry. I read that letter twice, then folded it and put it in the binder. The last thing I ever got from that whole mess. The orchard changed after that. The barn roof got finished. The cottage became my little writing room, with a small desk by the window and a blue quilt on the bed. I planted new apple trees in the spring. I fixed the bridge, but I kept the chain. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because I had learned the difference between a wall and a boundary. A wall is built to keep the world out. A boundary is built to remind the world where it has to stop. I saw Ronnie one more time the following summer. His truck sat down by the county road near the bridge for maybe 5 minutes. He did not get out. He did not honk. He did not shout. He just sat there looking up at the orchard, then drove away. I never saw him again after that. Sometimes I still think about the storm, about Lacey in the rain, about Cole looking out that car window, and I wonder whether I could have done something differently. Maybe I could have opened the gate and trusted that kindness would not be mistaken for surrender. Maybe I could have let them stay one night and hoped Ronnie would respect the line in the morning. But then I remember every fake notice, every threat, every lie told to people in town, every time he treated my no like it was a personal insult instead of an answer. And I think I did the only thing I could do. I held the line, so tell me what you think. If you were standing in that rain, with a moving truck at your gate, a frightened child in the car, and a man trying to force his way into a home that was not his, would you have opened the gate? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Leave your honest opinion in the comments, because I've learned that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is not fighting for what is yours. It is deciding where kindness ends and self-respect begins.